The fact that the US, together with Israel, basically have vetoed a ceasefire resolution repeatedly with only one small exception just tells you right there, you can't have effectively one country, the US, on the Security Council calling the shots and condemning the world to what looks to be now a major expanding war, which is extremely dangerous, which could go into a world war, which could go nuclear.
Hello, and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. My name is Fiona Edwards, and my co-host is Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement against the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. Before we get into today's very exciting discussion, just a little bit of housekeeping for you all. If you like what you hear, please do subscribe to this channel and click on the bell so that you receive a notification when we release new episodes every week. And if you appreciate our work, you can support us by becoming a member of Empire Watch on Patreon, and the link to this is in the description of this episode.
Today, we are very excited that joining us on Global Majority for Peace podcast is Dr. Jill Stein. Jill Stein is standing for the President of the United States for the Green Party. She's a Harvard-educated doctor, a pioneering environmental health advocate, and an organizer for People, Planet, and Peace. Jill, we are honored to have you on the show. Welcome.
It's an honor to be with you. Thank you so much for your work.
Well, just to start off with, if you were elected to be the next president of the United States of America, what would you do in your first 100 days in office to change the United States foreign policy agenda?
So it's actually not rocket science what needs to be done. And let me say that even before the inauguration, I would pick up the phone and call Bibi Netanyahu and tell him that his genocide is over, that he needs to cease and desist and begin backing off of the occupation, as well as ending the ethnic cleansing and especially his genocidal war on the Palestinian people, especially the people of Gaza. And we would put a weapons embargo and a aid embargo behind that. Prior presidents have done as much, including Ronald Reagan in 1982, who told Menachem Begin that Israel's war on Lebanon at the time was over. And within 24 hours, Israel had removed its troops and stopped its bombing. So we can do that as well. This is long overdue. There's a consensus here in the US, actually, that wants a weapons embargo right now, as well as an immediate ceasefire. And the world says as much, and the International Court of Justice, has issued very specific rulings. So Israel needs to begin to come into compliance with those rulings, starting with an end to the genocide right now. That's number one, and that doesn't have to wait even for the inauguration. More generally, in terms of foreign policy, we would shift towards a foreign policy based on international law, diplomacy, and human rights, rather than a foreign policy based on military and economic domination, because it's really not doing us any good whatsoever. And I would approach, in general, the position of the presidency as not simply being a commander-in-chief, but also being an organizer-in-chief to enable the American people to be informed and to be the driver of our decisions, including our foreign policy. So that means bringing back meaningful congressional hearings, which have long gone by the wayside. We should have congressional hearings, for example, on the role of the CIA and the deep state in U.S. foreign policy to help clarify to the American people what's going on and what needs to be changed. We would also bring back town hall meetings, which it's an outrage that they're not happening because our congressmen and women are too busy meeting with their donors rather than their voters. And we will use the bully pulpit of the presidency to name and shame those who are not willing to be instructed by their constituencies. And the American people are not favorably inclined towards this endless war machine, which is spending us into national poverty, basically, and endangering all of us. We would also undertake an antitrust lawsuit instructing the Department of Justice to basically break up the consolidated corporate media so that, again, we can begin to have media acting as a watchdog rather than a lapdog which is largely the function of the corporate media. We would also instruct the Department of Justice to take AIPAC to court for violations of the Foreign Agent Registration Act so that our elected officials can have less of an inducement, shall we say, to serve their big donors and more of an inducement to follow the principles of democracy. We would propose cuts to the military budget on the order of at least 50%. We would end regime change operations and endless wars. And, there are laws against providing military aid to other countries that are violating humanitarian rights, interfering with the delivery of humanitarian aid, or which are in violation of nuclear weapons treaties. So we would use the power of the presidency to curtail aid where we should not be providing that aid. And in general, we would enter into negotiations to end the war, this expanding war in the Middle East, which is extremely dangerous and is on the verge of a major expansion right now, which could go global and could go nuclear. We'll also enter into negotiations to bring an end to this very devastating and horrific and dangerous conflict in Ukraine.
Thank you for that. That's amazing. Of course, the US election is just around the corner, and you're standing in an election where the two main candidates, Trump and Harris, are both proposing very hawkish US foreign policies. Now, as you kind of have already gone through in your first 100 days, you're putting forth a very pro-peace agenda. You're very vocal against the US-Israeli genocide in Gaza. You oppose NATO's proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. However, anyone seriously challenging the US war machine gets attacked, smeared, called anti-Semitic, accused of being a foreign agent, and so on. For example, we've seen Black activists, the Uhuru 3, persecuted and falsely accused of being Russian agents for their opposition to NATO. You yourself have been on the receiving end of that type of smear campaigns. You are also accused of being a Russian agent yourself. So how do you deal with these attacks and smears? And what does this mean for free speech in the US?
So these attacks against me have been going on actually since I first began running for office 2 decades ago. So I've become quite accustomed to them, and they've not been able to come up with anything new. So they're basically rehashing old smears that have already really been laid to rest. And I think there's so many examples right now of these smears, which are massively backfiring. And if you read the social media postings of these smears, or you look at the comments on the YouTube episodes of, say, the Breakfast Club or Mehdi Hassan, for example, AOC's Instagram smear, they immeasurably backfire. And the comments are basically all to the effect, oh my God, I wasn't going to vote in this election. Now I see that there's someone worth voting for. So we say, bring it on, go ahead with the smears. They really help alert people to what a farce political establishment is, how terrified it is of competition. And it really just draws attention to who we are. The fact that the DNC is undertaking a whole advertising campaign now against us, to me, is such a great sign of our rising momentum. So I really don't worry about it, and I really don't engage very much with the press. Of course, you kind of have to, some people are listening. There's a whole new generation of press now, and younger people are much more likely to listen to our position because they too are struggling. The injustice of our era is very much generational, as well as class, racial, etc. And as a younger crop of reporters comes into their roles here in the press, they are much more likely to listen to us. So we're not being dismissed here out of hand. So, this is a conversation and a transition that we're calling for to end empire and oligarchy and endless war and rising fascism. They all go hand in hand. And the assault on our democracy, they're all kind of one and the same. And we've challenged that, and a lot of people are listening because the system is not working for anyone, and people very much see themselves in the target hairs right now. So any way that we can be brought into the conversation is very helpful.
We're just picking up on a really central element of US foreign policy, which is this US new Cold War against China. Unfortunately, we've got this anti-China policy, which is a bipartisan issue. Both the Democrats and Republicans are very committed to attempting to contain China through various aggressive measures, be that tariffs, sanctions, propaganda, smears, and diplomatic attacks. And at the same time, the US is also engaging in a massive military buildup in the Asia Pacific. Very recently, in September 2024, the US Congress passed 25 anti-China related bills in a week that was dubbed China Week. What is your opinion on the danger of this approach? And if you were president of the United States, would you pursue a different policy towards China?
Yes, absolutely. This approach is very counterproductive and very destructive to the US, not to mention that it endangers us. The US, now has troops in Taiwan, which are there supposedly in an advisory capacity, but that's how it always starts, or training capacity. So this is extremely dangerous in the same way that Biden-Harris now sending 100 troops to Israel, supposedly to assist with this missile defense system. That's extremely dangerous. I mean, this is how the war in Vietnam began and all that. They always start with advisors, and it's the slippery slope, which has been sliding in a very big way. So this is really dangerous. US foreign policy, in fact, kind of reoriented. This was basically a shift to the east in our foreign policy. And we've been revving up our nuclear weapons and undertaking a whole new generational replacement with more powerful weapons. This is part of the arms race, which is devastating to all of our economies. But specifically, we're making an enemy out of China. We need to compete economically with China. And tariffs don't really do that, because tariffs don't address the essential dysfunction of the US economy, an economy that has been financialized. And we need to address that financialization. Simply invoking tariffs is not going to do the trick. And the hostilities are extremely dangerous. And also, we are pushing Russia and China together, which Henry Kissinger knew was a fatal flaw. And that is now happening in a very big way. I believe China, if I'm not mistaken, has actually expressed sympathy with Russia and Iran in regard to this impending Middle East war that's on its way to going global. So this is a real danger, to be making an enemy of China. Our economies are far too interdependent, and simply invoking tariffs or punishing China economically is not going to help us. We need to strengthen the US economy, which has been systematically disabled through endless debt. We have a debt and a financialized economy right now, and that needs to be fixed in and of itself. Simply trying to strike out and crush China isn't going to work. China is an economic powerhouse, and it's not in a rising military power to answer the threats that the US has been raising against it. So this is not a productive path forward, simply to make an enemy out of China. We need to work together diplomatically, and, in a nutshell, we need to move from a unipolar world, a world based on one dominant power, which we are not anymore. We are not economically the dominant power. So we need to move to a multipolar world and transition from being the bully in the schoolyard to an adult in the room, able to work together based on international law and human rights to create a world that's going to work for all of us. When one power is trying to dominate all the others, forget it. It's not working now. We have lost every military conflict, arguably since Vietnam, but certainly not any of the post-2001 wars. We're losing them catastrophically. We've spent some $22 trillion on these wars since 2001. And what do we have to show for it? Failed states and mass refugee migrations that are coming our way, and continuing so-called terrorist threats. So this doesn't solve anything. It's great for the weapons industry and the military industrial complex, who are calling the shots. But for the American people, this is a disaster. Oh, I should mention also, according to Jeffrey Sachs, who's an advisor to our campaign, the average cost to the American household is $12,000 per year for the most recent military budget. So it's staggering. And the American people don't know this. They're not aware of it. And yet, even so, the American people oppose the endless war machine. So using the bully pulpit of the office, in fact, even just participating in the election, we can begin to really stir the pot here with a reality check, which really resonates with the American people.
Can you expand a little bit more on the issue of China, but from, I guess, a Green Party perspective, in terms of, China is the number one investor in green technology, whether it's solar, wind, or hydro energy. It's also leading in electric vehicles. and also has big programs to reforest the country. Of course, you mentioned tariffs. The US is attacking China's green technology with tariffs against solar and electric vehicles. What are your thoughts on this, and how is this impeding the global fight against climate change?
That's right. Yes. I mean, we should be competing to produce green energy, not striving to simply suppress it. So tariffs are not going to solve the climate crisis, which is really at full-blown crisis level now. Witness these back-to-back hurricanes in the southeast and the devastation. The fact that FEMA is out of money, we can give another almost $9 billion to Israel to conduct genocide, but we can't help everyday people and small businesses and all the rest recover from these devastating hurricanes. So we need to help industries in this country actually be productive. So currently, we do not have a productive economy. We have a very debt-ridden, financialized economy. So the long and short of it is that we need to fix the problem at that level. And we need to address the very high cost of labor right now, which is one of the drivers of the high cost of doing business in this country, which is one of the reasons we are not competitive. We need to make it possible for workers to actually have a decent life. And with the cost of housing skyrocketing and also the cost of healthcare, that is an enormous burden on the workforce, which is living paycheck to paycheck and barely making ends meet. And that also then translates into costs to business. So if we want our businesses to succeed, we need to enable our workers to succeed. So there's some win-win solutions here. Number one, we need to get healthcare off the back of businesses and off the back of workers. That means we need healthcare, which is provided efficiently. Right now, our health insurance has a built-in mountain of inefficiency. 1 out of every 3 healthcare dollars is not going to healthcare. It pays for bureaucracy and red tape and paper pushing and bloated CEO salaries. This is not addressing healthcare. We need to move to a Medicare for all type system, an improved Medicare for all, because there's some big holes that are being knocked into Medicare right now. So we need to restore Medicare, which typically had an overhead of 3% and very high satisfaction rates and freedom of choice. So you can see the provider that you want to see and get the care that you want at the hospital or healthcare center that you want to use. So Medicare for All will do all of that. It's great for consumers. It's great for people. It's great for our health. And it's great economically because it saves us. Actually, it doesn't cost us. It saves us because of this high inefficiency. 1 out of every 3 healthcare dollars basically being wasted right now. So by moving to Medicare for All, we not only can expand healthcare to cover everyone, but also cover everyone comprehensively. So it's your mental health. It is your dental care. It's your reproductive health. It is pharmaceuticals completely covered from cradle to grave. Home care and chronic care. So this is an enormous benefit to the American worker and to American businesses and to the economy. Healthcare would be paid for through a very progressive tax base, which would actually lower the burden that people are currently paying. Now, if you add up all the ways we pay healthcare costs, it lowers the burden for middle income, low income, and the poor, lowers their burden, and it raises the burden on the super rich who need to be paying their fair share. So all over, the healthcare costs are reduced in addition by over 30%. So that's one thing that we can do to start competing more effectively to make our renewable energy industries more competitive. Another one is to deal with the high cost of housing, because that cost of housing translates essentially to burdens on workers and on businesses. They need workers that can survive and that can have a place to sleep, and currently they really don't. So there's a lot we can do on that front as well. We need to be investing in housing as a human right. We need housing in the public domain rather than for profit. We need so-called public housing. Now it's more often called social housing, which is high quality mixed income housing, but especially addresses the needs of working people and the poor as well. And that needs to be built in a way which is environmentally efficient. In fact, we include it in our Green New Deal, which addresses several key industries for going green. But housing is part of that because energy inefficient and unsustainable housing is very costly to the environment in all ways. So we call for building public transportation to serve concentrated housing and to preserve green space for environmental reasons, but we also need green space because it's really healthy for us to all have access to green space. So we kind of fold that together. The bottom line, in terms of China and competition, is that by ensuring that we have quality housing, and we would also implement nationwide rent control to stop the skyrocketing housing prices and the rising rates of eviction and homelessness, we would implement a federal rent control program that will also help stabilize these rising costs of housing, which eventually translate to a burden on workers and businesses. So these are some of the ways that we would begin to unfinancialize our economy and create an economy that can really work and help our green industries become competitive internationally.
Fantastic. I mean, it's really great to hear that holistic vision, and also like how much better would the world be if the United States was competing with China to be more green? I mean, we wouldn't have the problem that we have right now, which is that we're hurtling towards, a climate catastrophe. On that theme of catastrophe and avoiding it, the threat of nuclear war is really growing. This is in large part due to the terrifying escalation of the NATO proxy war in Ukraine. We've obviously seen hundreds of billions of dollars sent to Ukraine in military aid. There's a clamor within NATO for even more direct confrontation with Russia, and including providing Ukraine with long-range missiles to hit Russia. How did we get here? Is there a path to peace? What is the alternative towards this escalation toward basically a possible third world war?
Yes. So it's not rocket science at all about how to deal with this. This is basically like the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s. And when you do diplomacy, it's like having a human relationship. You need to be able to put yourself in the shoes of the person, whether it's an ally or an adversary. You have to be able to see their side as well in order to find the common ground. And so it's important, for people to remember, we've been here. We've been here when Russia moved missiles to Cuba, and we basically had the nuclear weapons in the airplanes launched. We were very touchy about our borders, and we still are very touchy about our borders. And we basically created the Monroe Doctrine, which still exists, that says no other country may come to our hemisphere, let alone on our borders. And that's basically the position that Russia has taken. We promised Gorbachev back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we made the promise that when Germany was allowed to reunify, which has always been a threat to Russia, Russia's been invaded several times by a unified Germany, we promised Russia, and NATO promised Russia, the West promised Russia, but especially James Baker under George Bush promised Russia we would not move NATO 1 inch to the east of Germany. So that promise was violated for the first time in the mid-1990s, just a couple of years after it was made. And Russia kind of went ballistic, saying, no, you can't do this. And virtually all well-informed experts on Eastern Europe and Russia absolutely knew that this would be a disaster, that Russia will, if pushed, go to the mat. This is an existential threat to Russia's existence, just like having Russian missiles on our border in Cuba was an existential threat to us. And the long predicted has happened, and Russia has offered innumerable opportunities to negotiate, specifically on the one demand that Ukraine remain neutral, neutrality for Ukraine, so that there would not be nuclear weapons within minutes of a striking distance against Moscow. Not an unreasonable demand for neutrality. That's what Austria did following the Second World War. Austria maintained neutrality. That's perfectly workable. But unfortunately, with the warmongers in US office, we basically had a continuing march to the east. And then the US participated in a coup against the democratically elected ruler of Ukraine, who had taken a position of neutrality. And the US, together with Victoria Nuland, whose phone conversation was famously leaked as she was planning who the new ruling parties would be, who the new rulers effectively would be. The US assisted in that very violent coup. You had John McCain and Victoria Nuland out there in the Maidan handing out cookies to support what became a very violent and bloody protest, which led to the coup and basically drove out Yanukovych. So that was really the beginning of active hostilities and suppression of the Russian-speaking population, largely in the eastern provinces, and a number of consequent events, the threats that Ukraine would take over Crimea and Russia's only warm water port, which again was an existential threat. So it's unfortunate, but Russia wasn't going to allow that to happen. That was perfectly clear. And there was also a referendum in Crimea, which was largely populated by Russian speakers who wanted to be annexed by Russia. And same thing from the eastern provinces that were long asking Russia, can we please become part of the Russian Federation? And Russia, for a long time, was saying, no, you need to be independent. Let's abide by the Minsk Accords. But others did not abide by the Minsk Accords. And the hostilities were ongoing. Thousands upon thousands of people in the eastern provinces, Russian speakers, were killed by this very aggressive policy that was taken by Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, against Russian speakers. So there were hostilities going on here, very active hostilities, certainly since 2014. And regrettably, Russia invaded, which is a violation of international law. You're not allowed to do that. It was a criminal and brutal act, and that war is horrific and absolutely brutal. But the US has basically given thumbs up and pours gasoline on those fires continuously. And instead of supporting a ceasefire or a negotiated solution, the US has been on the other side, basically whipping up the conflict, pouring money into it, and also disrupting a peace treaty that actually was created under the auspices of Turkey, a peace agreement where Russia was actually very willing to compromise on a number of really critical fronts. And the US and the UK actually disrupted that and told Ukraine in no uncertain terms that they were not allowed to seek peace here. So this is devastating. It's absolutely devastating to the people of Ukraine who've been sustaining an absolutely huge jaw-dropping burden on Ukraine. You know, according to our Secretary of Defense, we were going to be fighting this war basically to bleed Russia, not because we thought we could win, but because we could essentially draw down on Russia's resources. So this is like a war being fought to the last Ukrainian for the benefit of a very aggressive US policy that doesn't benefit the stability of the world, doesn't benefit the people of the US. What exactly are our interests here, except delivering more contracts to the war profiteers who are in the business of calling the shots in Congress? And this is an absolute betrayal of the interests of the American people.
Of course, ironically, if you listen to the mainstream media, it's Russia and China that are the most aggressive, most threatening forces in the world, even though the US is by far the biggest military force in the world. I mean, the US has over 900 foreign military bases and spends more than 1.5 trillion on the military per year, according to research from the Tricontinental Institute. So that might be a little bit of a different figure than some people might say, but the US also pushes its allies to increase their military spending, and that is happening across NATO countries. So the difference between what's happening now and you is that you're standing as a president that is pledging to cut military spending by 50 to 75% and ensure a just transition that replaces military jobs with Green New Deal jobs. Could you expand a little bit on that and explain what that's about?
Yes. So on the first day of our administration, we will recognize that we are in a climate emergency. By using those words, climate emergency, we actually then unleash over $500 billion every year to deal with that emergency. And the Green New Deal is the plan for dealing with that emergency. We basically create millions of jobs, good jobs, union jobs, well-paying jobs to ensure that no worker is left behind. And in fact, this is an advantage to the economy, creating more jobs and jobs that are good for workers, good for the local environment, good for the communities in which these jobs exist, so that they are not polluting. They don't destroy the water supply, unlike fracking, which draws down on our aquifers and our scarce water in the age of climate change and grave drought, especially here in this country, in the Southwest, in a lot of fracking country. We have water shortages, and fracking draws down on massive quantities of that water and pollutes it and renders it essentially unusable. So we would be putting all of this on a sound, healthy healthy and sustainable footing, and transitioning workers out of military industries, out of fossil fuel, out of nuclear, out of all the unsustainable industries that are contributing to the climate crisis, and moving those workers into jobs in key industries that are the pillars of a sustainable, just, and peaceful green economy. So that means in energy, we're moving to solar, wind, geothermal efficiencies, weatherizing our homes and businesses and schools and so on. So lots of jobs there. We also move to public and renewably powered transportation. Electric vehicles are great, but they're not a cost-effective way to solve this problem. If we're really going to solve the crisis of transportation, it needs to be solved with a high-quality public transportation system, which we can build within cities and then cross-continental rail system. And we need housing, which is built in conjunction with transportation so that we're not adding. And in fact, we can then remove and phase out essentially the single person automobile traffic that creates such a mess out of our communities and our air and our climate. So housing is a third piece, and then agriculture is a fourth major piece. We need sustainable regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture, which is truly sustainable in the crisis of the climate and uses much less water. We need a sustainable agriculture system, not the one that we have, which is extremely inefficient, is exhausting our water supplies and our topsoil and polluting it and polluting the food with pesticides and so on. So we can do a much better job in those four key industries, and the Green New Deal and the climate emergency and the $600 billion per year is how we jumpstart this and make all that happen. Some of these industries also need to be brought into public ownership, management, and planning, because you're not going to have a rational rail system without public ownership. Currently, our rail system is extremely chaotic and uncoordinated. I mean, as is our energy system and everything else. So there are certain key industries where the public needs to be in control, and the planning needs to involve the public, involve our communities, and to be transparent and accountable rather than driven by top dollar, which is kind of the current way of the world in our current economic system.
Oh, wow, that's such an exciting vision. I mean, it's just so crazy that to get between cities and states in the United States, you're using airplanes rather than high-speed rail. Like if you look at places like China, there's such an amazing system where you can travel huge distances. So that's a really phenomenal vision. I mean, just moving into a slightly different topic, we are witnessing really huge shifts in the world today. We're seeing the rise of the global south economically, for example. And alongside this increase in economic power, we're also seeing the growth of international organizations that promote cooperation within the global south. So you've got the rise of BRICS, the Group of 77 plus China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and so on. There's loads of these organizations. In terms of the international community as a whole, there are some major issues. And what I'm talking about here is about the global north's approach to the United Nations and international law, because it remains the case, for example, that amongst the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council with veto power, China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, there isn't any representation from either Africa or Latin America. And we've also seen how Israel, with the full backing of the United States, has repeatedly violated international laws, ignored decisions of the General Assembly and rulings of the International Court of Justice, and so on. So what needs to change?
Well, we need a UN that is run on more democratic principles. Right now, the Security Council essentially preserves the power structure of the post-World War II era. And those countries that were in power at the end of the Second World War remain in power on a global basis. So if we're going to truly have a world that can step back from the brink of self-destruction right now, which is what we're at, we need to put the body of law that was created coming out of the Second World War, we need to put that to work with small d democracy. And the UN has made a good start, but it needs to go much further. And there are major reforms. Now, I am not currently a student of this discussion, so I can't tell you offhand exactly what the best reforms are, but they clearly need to be put on the table. They need discussion. And it's just patently evident that a small cluster of powerful nations from the 1950s cannot be forever on the throne. We need to be in a multipolar world with shared power. And whether the Security Council should be abolished or whether it should be entirely on a rotating membership or something else, I really can't tell you off the top of my head what that answer is. But you can be sure there are a lot of people who've been studying this and who have some good proposals on the table, discussion and consideration. The fact that the US together with Israel basically have vetoed a ceasefire resolution repeatedly with only one small exception just tells you right there, you can't have effectively one country, the US, on the Security Council calling the shots and condemning the world to what looks to be now a major expanding war, which is extremely dangerous, which could go into a world war, which could go nuclear. We badly need to change that. And how we change that has everything to do with having an informative public discussion. Our First Amendment rights are first for very good reason, because the founders understood that you cannot have good policy without an informed electorate. So we need to be talking about the realities, especially of the endless war machine that the US military effectively is. We are an empire, and that has a huge cost here at home, both to our democracy and to our economy. And above all, we are all in the target hairs of the danger. We are on the verge of nuclear war on at least two fronts right now. And nuclear war is not local. No exchange of nuclear weapons is local. When you see that mushroom cloud, that is a conveyor belt, which is bringing debris into the upper atmosphere where it doesn't weather down. So every time you have a nuke, even a small tactical nuke, which is now defined basically including the size of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, those are now considered tactical. So our reckless criminal misleaders talk about tactical nuclear war, and it's over there, so don't worry about it. That is just such dangerous ignorance or malfeasance, whatever you want to call it. That's absolutely outrageous. And it's not true. The American people need to know that we are all in the target hairs of any nuclear conflict right now. It doesn't take very many tactical nuclear weapons to put us into nuclear winter, where agricultural production all over the world is suppressed. And you get to on the order of 100 or more tactical nukes, we're into starvation for a billion or even billions, or all of us if you get into an actual major nuclear war. So this is not a place we need to go. We need to be going rapidly to the abolition of nuclear weapons through the Nuclear Ban Treaty, which is now in force as a global treaty. And the US and other nuclear weapons nations need to step up to the plate. And it's up to us as citizens of the planet to make this happen. We have been very effective in the past as a global movement to implement critical nuclear treaties. And we need that movement again to be ramped up, which means people just need to be informed. If people knew how terminal this danger is and what an absolute wipeout this is for all of us and how close we are to the nuclear brink right now, people would be beating down the doors of our hallowed halls in this country and around the globe to eliminate nuclear weapons now, once and forever. That needs to happen as quickly as possible.
For the final question, can we talk about democracy within the US itself? Your campaign has faced so many challenges. Could you talk us through some of these and what it tells us about the limits of US democracy? Also, could you speak to your strategy as a third party? How can the anti-war movement break through the two-party duopoly?
Yeah, so these questions are very intertwined. So there are many impediments to democracy. It's best summed up by the former Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who said, "We have a choice between vast concentrations of wealth or democracy." Unfortunately, this country has chosen the former. When you have very concentrated wealth, it will find a way of distorting any democratic and electoral process. And that process has been underway for a long time. Arguably, we've never had real or full democracy. We were founded on an economy of slavery and did not count either women or non-landholders or African Americans as actual full voting citizens. So we've had to kind of crawl our way up here. But lately, we've been racing in the opposite direction, not crawling forward at all. all. And money has been extremely concentrated, especially in the last decade or so. And in the last couple of years, we saw billionaires double their wealth, while poverty rates among children have tripled in this country to absolutely outrageous levels. So we're an oligarchy. We are really not a democracy, and money talks. And we at one point had campaign finance rules that set some limits on the power of oligarchs to buy our elections. But those rules have basically been busted to smithereens right now. And through super PACs, through dark money, through so-called victory funds, there are all these legalized loopholes for corruption, or I should say loopholes for legalized corruption, but the fact that it's legal doesn't mean it's not corrupt. When money is basically buying out our democracy, and it's a pay-to-play political system where Wall Street and the war machine and big pharma and health insurance and the real estate industry, they really call the shots at the level of the White House, Congress, state capitals, and in our municipalities as well. It's really pervasive. In this election, let me say, one of the biggest hurdles we've had is ballot access, because when laws and regulations are bought and paid for, you can be sure that the economic elites create rules to keep people-powered campaigns off the ballot and out of the discussion. So we are effectively shadow banned on social media. We know that from the Twitter files that Elon Musk had granted access to the internal communications of Twitter. And yes, I am classified along with WikiLeaks, which I consider a great honor, as is Russian and severely suppressed on social media. And, it's not just me. Lots of us are suppressed, especially if we're objecting to the endless war machine. So we're suppressed on legacy media, and in social media, we are kept off the ballot by these outrageous rules that basically grandfather you in if you're already a big party. Otherwise, you have to collect, if you were starting from the beginning, you'd have to collect 1 million signatures before you'd actually be on the ballot as a competitive voice. We began the election already having ballot status on many of the large states, because as Greens, we've learned how to watchdog our ballot status and maintain it basically through running candidates and achieving a certain number of votes. But there are 50 different rules, 51, including the District of Columbia. And it is a very daunting process to fight this battle in order to actually be on the ballot across the country. We were very determined from the start. We wanted to be on the ballot for just about every voter, because if you're challenging empire, you cannot do that in a credible way unless you are on the ballot. So we are on the ballot now for about 95% of voters having played that game, which entailed going to court many times. We're still in court on a couple cases, because if you're going to challenge these rules, and also not only the rules, but let me put it this way, the Democrats hired what they called an army of lawyers early in the campaign in order to throw us off the ballot, in order to throw their competition. This is what authoritarianism looks like. This is a serious threat to democracy, in the same way that Donald Trump not recognizing and not allowing the peaceful transfer of power or recognizing the outcome of the election, that is a threat to a democracy. It's also a serious, equally devastating threat to democracy to prevent the exercise of free and fair voting, by throwing competitors off the ballot. This is what authoritarian countries do, and the Democrats excel at that. The Republicans, they have their own techniques to strip voter rolls of competitors they don't want, but the Democrats do their part in that as well. And throwing candidates off the ballot, the Democrats kind of excel at this. So they have an army of lawyers. They threw us off the ballot in many states, and then we have to go to court to challenge them. We have prevailed in most of those cases, but not quite all of them. So that's a big hurdle. It ties up your money. It ties up your time. It's a very anti-democratic tactic. They also publicly advertised for people to manage spies and infiltrators to mess up our operations. And that's posted on our social media so people can read it. I long suspected that was going on, but we didn't have proof. This is absolute proof, and they've been caught red-handed before. In 2022, the Democrats impersonated the Greens, called up people who had signed our petitions, and said that they were the Green Party. Would you please take your name off of this ballot petition to get a Green anti-war candidate on the ballot running for Senate in 2022 in North Carolina? They happened to call the co-chair of the Green Party of the state, who recorded the conversation and presented it in court, and they were found guilty. In my view, they should have been found guilty of fraud and election interference, because how is that not worse than some irrelevant social media meme posted by the Russian Internet Research Agency, which posted a number of irrelevant and ludicrous memes, and that was called election interference. Well, if you're actually calling people up, misrepresenting yourself as that party and manipulating people into basically getting a candidate removed from the ballot, how's that not election interference? I don't know. But it was judged very gently and a few $1,000 fine. But proof of principle here that the Democrats, they need to be renamed the anti-democratic party. They also interfered with the distribution of our matching funds, public money, which would have enabled us to have gotten on the ballot in a couple more states where we were not able, because we didn't have the money at the time to do it, where we had to pay a big fee, for example, in Oklahoma. So they've used ridiculous, dishonest, manipulative, anti-democratic tactics to silence their opposition. That is not what democracy looks like. That's the kind of thing they rely on, and which outrages the American people. They should have allowed us into debates. Debates should be based on choices that the American people have. If you are on the ballot in enough states that you could, in theory, win the election, which is how the League of Women Voters used to run the debates, that's the way it should be run now. The Democrats don't do that. In fact, they don't even work through the commission on presidential debates right now. They just sort of schedule things ad hoc, and they collude in order to lock out other candidates, which should be a violation of campaign finance laws. But, the whole system is sort of biased in their favor right now. So it's kind of a culture of manipulation, a predatory form of politics. Why? Because they are terrified that people should discover that they have a choice and that they learn what those choices are. And that, in fact, we do have solutions to solve this devastating crisis of unaffordable housing. People are being evicted and going homeless in record numbers. The crisis of healthcare, the crisis of debt, the climate crisis, you name it, and the crisis of endless war and the devastating cost of that to everyday Americans and our small businesses. We can solve these problems, and we have the solutions to do it. And let me say the numbers are there to do it as well. 1 out of every 3 eligible voters chose not to vote in the presidential race of 2020 because they inherently reject these corporate-sponsored predatory candidates and the zombie parties that represent them. So if we were able to get the word out to the grassroots out there, and these non-voters, by the way, just happen to be younger, lower income, and of color in much higher proportions. So these are the people who would enormously benefit from our agenda, including abolishing student debt and medical debt, making public higher education free, rent control across the country, et cetera. The other things that we've discussed. To get the word out is to basically win the argument. The minute we get to the microphone, we win the argument. That's what they're terrified of. If they were actually terrified of a split vote, of us spoiling the election, that can be solved through ranked choice voting. And we've had that solution on the table for a long time. The Democrats fight it. And actually the Republicans do too, but the Democrats especially, because they are terrified that they can't use fear campaigning. They rely on fear campaigning to get people to vote based on who you hate the most, rather than who you actually support. And that's no way to move a democracy forward. Democracy needs a vision. It needs an agenda. It needs an explicit goal. And we very much subscribe to the words of Frederick Douglass, who said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. We have to be that demand. That demand is strong. We have the numbers that, in theory, we could even win this election. So bottom line, if anybody out there is a U.S. citizen, or you have a green card, you live in the U.S. or not, you can win this election on behalf of your future and your children and a world that works for all of us. You can join in no matter where you are. You can be part of this grassroots movement. And this is simply a matter of going to our website, jillstein2024.com, and sign up to volunteer. If you can contribute, make a contribution. Every dollar helps us hire more organizers to support this grassroots movement. But this is how grassroots campaigns can win. And because they're drawing on non-traditional voters, it won't show up in the polls. It will completely come out of left field. So we really encourage people to go to our website, again, jillstein2024.com, sign up, contribute, but especially sign up to volunteer. If you volunteer, you then have support to make phone calls, to be part of the calling effort, phone banking, and we provide you the script and the numbers, who to call. We can give you access to flyers. We can provide you with the flyers. tabling to get the word out, whether it's a CSA, a farmer's market, a grocery store, festivals, and door knocking, and then social media and so on. So just by turning the crank of regular old grassroots outreach, typically called get out the vote, but it's also voter persuasion. It's mostly informing and empowering voters that they actually have agency in this election, and that every vote for our campaign is a vote against genocide. It is a vote against World War III that we're on the verge of. It is a vote for healthcare as a human right, for affordable housing as a human right, for ending student debt, and so on. We can actually achieve these things if we stand up with our numbers. And even if we don't win the White House, we win the day by having a strong base and showing that there is a very active, vibrant constituency that is fighting for this agenda for people, planet, and peace over profit. We have the numbers, and however strong we show up on election day and in the early voting, it's all to the good. This is a win-win. There is no lesser evil in this campaign. There is no lesser evil when one is conducting genocide and the other one is saying to hurry up and finish the job, when they are both attacking and the Democrats are leading the attack on our basic First Amendment rights. There is no lesser evil here. The abortion problem could be solved right now by the Democrats. They can set up abortion clinics right now on federal land in every state, in multiple sites on every state. So this is a concocted problem to enable them to use fear and extort your vote. Do not let your vote be extorted. Do not sell your soul here by voting for genocide. If you vote for genocide, you are affirming and enabling it. Children being massacred on an industrial scale, they are not backing off. They are now expanding this genocide into the West Bank and arguably into Lebanon as well. And they're about to attack Iran. And the US is sending boots on the ground as well as special missiles. And Kamala Harris, along with Joe Biden, are in this. They are in this to the last American, effectively, not just to the last Israeli, to the last American. We can use international law and human rights here and ensure that everyone has security. This is not about sacrificing Jews. And in fact, the issue is not a religious one. It is an issue of Zionism, which is a political ideology that is not subscribed to, has always been controversial, actually, within Judaism. And I say this as a Jew myself, born right after the Holocaust. Zionism is the problem, and this is readily fixed. And Israel can simply comply with international law here and ensure that everyone has security, dignity, and justice, and the full rights of citizenship from the river to the sea and beyond. We can solve that problem right now in a way that is sustainable and just for everyone. Otherwise, we are going down essentially this road to death and destruction for us all, and we don't need to go there. We can fix this if we stand up and we insist that we have a government that's working for us, not for AIPAC and the war contractors. So again, every vote for our campaign is a vote for a sustainable, just future and a peaceful future for us all. This is within our reach. So please join the team and let's make it happen.
Jill, you're such a powerful voice for peace and against war. And I mean, the relentless struggle that you've been going through just to get that voice on the ballot paper. I mean, it says it all, it just says how powerful this message is that they're so determined to stop it. And that website you mentioned, we're going to be putting that in the show notes. Do you want to say it one more time for our listeners?
So it is jillstein2024.com. You can make a contribution, you can sign up as a volunteer, and that's how we really turn the crank here, and we become an unstoppable grassroots army for the peaceful, just, green future that is within our reach.
Excellent. Definitely check that out. Ileana, any final thoughts you want to share?
No, but thank you so much, Jill, for coming on. We know it's really busy for you. We wish you all the best, and I'm excited to see, like you're saying, this really strong foundation that you're building, no matter what happens.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your voices and all the great work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And just one final thing is, if you've enjoyed this conversation, do leave a comment, share it with your friends, spread the word. As Jill's saying, the anti-war majority is being suppressed. So we actually need your support to get this message out there. And if you like our work, do become a subscriber on Patreon. Best of luck, Jill. We'll be keeping our fingers crossed and hopefully see what the result is later on in November.
Great. Okay. Well, carry on, as we will, no matter what, and we will prevail. Eventually we will. Thank you so much for all you do, Fiona and Ileana. Great talking with you.
Thank you, Jill.